terribly excited to welcome Anthony here. I think I already just told you, but really, I think really Metaculus, and especially the current project on predicting the pandemic is popping up in really every third salon. So sometimes because I plug it, but oftentimes really because participants bring it up, because I think in thinking about how can we use this kind of as how can we use the current crisis as an impetus to kind of get more evidence-based policy making and more evidence-based decision making going. I think really Metaculus is really I think the prime example that one can point to where this is working really well, where you have a very, very flourishing community of contributors that are really quite committed in trying to update according to evidence, and trying to kind of use the collective intelligence of the crowd, and getting better at predicting events that seem kind of out of the scope for someone who's thinking about this singularly. And so I'm super thrilled to have you here today. I'm gonna, I think, give you the floor for as long as possible, really. But I'm gonna share a little bit more about Metaculus in the chat here. And you are, I think, wearing many, I think, amazing hats that are quite crucial, I think, for long-term flourishing of humanity. You are the co-founder of the Future of Life Institute and the co-founder of the Foundational Questions Institute, which is a really fantastic organization with amazing YouTube videos. I'm gonna share some links to that too. They're just totally mind-boggling. And you're a professor as well at UC Santa Cruz. So I think you've really quietly launched a lot of projects that I think are doing fantastic work for the long-term future. And then I think really Metaculus started I think as a really kind of very volunteer driven effort, really with a lot of amazing contributors that are contributing and kind of trying to see whether we can improve our collective sense making by asking the right questions. And I think one really cool difference of Metaculus and many other of those platforms is that the questions that are asked are really good. I think, I went to a few Augur and Gnosis when it was, I think, still in beta, and most of the questions there, which were open for prediction, was around sports and so on and so forth. And so I think if you go on the questions on Metaculus, you kind of see that the community is really interested in the long term. So I'm going to share a little bit more info about both of those projects here in the chat. But for now, I want to give the stage to you. I encourage all of the participants to collect questions in the chat, and then we can maybe if they're directly relevant, you can kind of politely unmute yourself and ask Anthony, and if there are more general questions, then we'll take them at the end. All right. Okay. Welcome, Anthony. I can't wait. I can't wait for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Allison, for both the invitation and the plugging Metaculus on every third meeting or so, and for the very kind introduction. So yeah, I wanted to talk about Metaculus a little bit, sort of as a whole, and then get into the recent pandemic specific project that we've started, pandemic.metaculus.com. And as Allison said, I'm happy to take questions as we go if you have some way of making me notice them, because I'll be sharing my screen, so you'll be small, but just jump in if you have a question while we're going. So I've got some slides, but of course it's much more fun to just discuss things than talk. So please jump in. I will share these now if I can. Let's see. Okay. Okay, looking good. All right. So so I've been thinking a lot about prediction over the years, and we're all equipped with an amazing prediction device, our brains. That's, I think, a lot of what it's doing most of the time is predictive modeling, but we don't really so much think explicitly about it, but that's what it's doing a lot. And of course, we have the great innovation over the past few hundred years has been science and modeling to make predictions about how things happen in nature and how the natural world operates. And that ability to model and predict qualitatively and quantitatively underlies sort of all of our modern technology and society. So that's an amazing thing that we have. We also have markets which do a very good job at predicting values of things or establishing values of things. And in some ways, there are lots of ways that markets can give us a sense of what's going to happen in their reaction to things before they happen. And all these things are really good, but they're not really quite good enough because they don't cover a large set of things that are complex, large-scale issues that aren't easily amenable to scientific modeling or sort of easy, simple physical theory, but are complex systems, but aren't treated in the existing financial markets or have some existing large-scale system to predict them. And they're sort of difficult enough that our brains are not naturally adapted to making predictions about them like many day-to-day phenomena, but we really need to have predictions about them. And so that kind of gap is what led us to think about Metaculus and kind of crowdsourced predictions. I don't like the word crowd because it gives this idea of like all these people jostling together, whereas I think really it's a much more kind of orderly and principled group of people talking to each other in very like productive and rational ways rather than like chanting what they think the answer is. But I'll say what we wanted to build with Metaculus is a platform to like ask interesting questions, and asking the questions turns out to be one of the harder parts, making the questions good, improving those questions, calibrating people's predictions about them, and then optimally aggregating those. So I think there are a lot of functions here: the question soliciting process, the improving process, the kind of gathering of predictions, the calibrating them, and then putting it all together into one system. And all of these, I think, have important aspects to them that I'll want to discuss a bit. So that's what Metaculus is, in brief. The point of it is to, let me just take a quick pause to see if I can eliminate this window that's blocking my view. Okay, there we go. The goal of it really is about decision making, because really decisions are kind of what we do to get by in the world and make things interesting and better. And all decisions are based on predictions. We make a decision based on, if I do this, here's what I think is going to happen. If I do this, here's what I think is going to happen. Let me compare those two things to what I want to happen and make a prediction accordingly. And so make a decision accordingly. And so we're implicitly making predictions. That's not always the way it feels. Often we just make decisions by habit. But if we really think about a hard decision, this is what we're doing. And so we want to improve that decision-making capability for everybody, groups, individuals, corporations, governments, humanity as a whole, by making predictions better in general. So I'm curious as to how many people have actually been, let's see if I can get this view. How many people have actually been on Metaculus? Is there a hand raise or a thumbs up or something? So
there is a hand raise as well in the participant panel. So if you guys want to use that. Oh yeah, I see a few people raising their hands.
Not zero, but not everybody.
Sylvan, Christine, Ben. We have virtually raising 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh my God, we have I think over 10 hand raises. So more hand raises than not hand raises.
So around half. Okay, so I will bore half of you and tell the other half how it works.
No, Metaculus could have predicted this, of course.
Easily, yeah. 50-50 is always easy to predict. So the way it works basically is you sign up. That makes it much more fun, although you can just browse and make predictions anonymously. You can propose a question if you like, although it's more fun to start by reading them. There's a team of moderators who will help you refine and get your question approved. So a good question has like some background. It has some like a fairly pithy central question. This is an example on, will SpaceX land people on Mars prior to 2030? It's got some like pretty clear resolution criteria. This turns out to be much harder than you think before you start making questions and predicting on them, to like nail down the details of, do the people have to be alive when they land on Mars? Does a crash landing count? All these sorts of things. So there's a bunch of refining that has to happen. Better that it happen early than argue about it later when, you know, half of the thing lands on Mars and half of it goes somewhere else, and all those, everything that can happen differently than you think it's going to does, as it turns out. So it's good to nail these things down beforehand. Then you can make predictions. This is a binary, so you can predict a probability between 1 and 99%. There are also numerical questions where you basically predict a probability distribution over some set of values or dates. And there's some way to express different probability distributions that you'll see if you log on. So then, whoops. Then, as questions resolve due to things happening or not happening in the real world, you accrue a track record. So this is the track record. I think this is probably mine or something, where in this, actually this has been revamped lately. So here, low scores are good, but if you go to the platform now, we reverse it. So good scores will be at the top of this plot. These are Breyer scores, and I'll explain more about the scoring system later. But you accrue a track record. This is fun and interesting just for yourself, to like try to be improving, to see how well you're doing, and to just basically render yourself accountable for your predictions. That's sort of one of the major points of it. And then as you accrue your track record, Metaculus is also, you know, keeping track of how well you're doing. And then the idea for the Metaculus prediction is that it takes the prediction on a given question of everybody who's made a prediction, and then does some weighting according to, it does some recalibration of everybody according to like how well calibrated they were in the past, and some weighting according to how well they've done basically as a predictor, what is their track record, and then combines all those into some preferably better than everybody individually score or prediction called the Metaculus prediction. So that's the idea of it, that it's both allowing everybody to individually make predictions, but also as a system combining those predictions into something that is where the aim is to do the best possible job of aggregating all that information, including track records, into a single prediction. So the current status of this, I would say, is that after several years of effort, it's a full-featured platform for predictors. I mean, the predictors always want more stuff and more features and things, which we're trying very hard to provide, but it works. You know, I think it's got all the basic tools to make the sort of predictions that people want to make. It's a very active community. There was a time when I could log on to Metaculus and be like, oh, look, somebody made a comment today. That was at the very beginning. Now it's sort of way too much going on for anybody to actually keep up with all of it. And that's a great thing. We've had a total of about 300,000 visitors. There's 12,000 registered users. There are about 1,900 questions with 250,000 predictions on them and 25,000 comments. Now, some of these numbers are like 25,000 or 275,000 visitors, and the number of registered users are pretty low, really, by the standards of like online popular websites, right? Those are pretty small numbers, but I think those belie the amount of sort of time and effort that people have put into it. And what's more interesting to me is that the 250,000 predictions and the 1,900 questions. That means each question has like of order 100 or more predictions on it, and that's real numbers. Like 100 predictions on a question is really enough to get good statistics and to be able to pick and choose who you listen to on that question and so on. And 1,900 questions is a lot of different things about the world that are being predicted, and more coming in all the time. Now, the lesson I've taken from this personally is, I'm super happy that Metaculus is now active and vibrant and operating well, but it's taken a lot of work. So don't underestimate, if you're thinking about starting an online community of some sort, do not underestimate how hard it is. Survivor bias is huge. Every online community that you see is like surprising success compared to the 99.9 probably percent of online communities that you don't see because they didn't get big and so you didn't see them, or they failed and so you didn't see them. So keep that in mind if you're starting. I'm not discouraging you from doing it, but don't underestimate how hard it is to get lots of people to come to your site and do interesting things on it. So I feel both tired and good that that has now sort of come together, and the site I think is really kind of thriving and there's a lot going on. To give a sense, I think the crucial point of Metaculus, I mean, there are several, but certainly the central one is to make good predictions. And let me just, once again, stop for 1 second. Whoops. Didn't actually want to do that. There we go. So a crucial thing is to make good predictions, and it turns out to be quite tricky to know exactly how to quantify what it means to like make good predictions in general. So one thing you're invited to do is just go and look at the track record. So there's a page which you can see here where you can just see every question that Metaculus has made a prediction on and then has had an outcome, and see what the prediction was and what the outcome was. And then there are various ways that you can score that. It's quite tricky to know how to say, like, this system as a whole is better than a bunch of pundits writing articles in the New York Times. I think that's almost certainly true, but it's hard to show it exactly because pundits writing articles in the New York Times are exactly the people who don't like have a clear thing that they're predicting, make a probabilistic prediction, and like record it and be held to account for it. So there are lots of prediction systems ongoing in the world that you simply have no idea how well they're doing. And that's actually part of the problem and part of what we're hoping to change, because it's just very hard to know who to believe if you've got many different people making predictions that aren't accountable and you like aren't quantifiable and aren't recorded and aren't kept track of. So that's what is happening here. So one one of the simplest ways you could look at some measure of predictive accuracy is the very popular Breyer score. There are many ways, and I'm talking about this one because it's popular and fairly straightforward to compute and think about. So it's just the squared difference between the predicted probability and the outcome. So if you predict 90% and the outcome is yes, it happened, you count that yes, it happened as a 1, so you have a 0.1 squared is a 0.01. So a Breyer score of 0.01 is like a confident prediction that was right. And so, and similarly, if you predicted 10%, then you'd have a like 0.8 Breyer score, so you'd be over here. So this is just a histogram of the Breyer score of the Metaculus prediction for binary questions. So over on the left is confident and right. Over on the right is confident and wrong. And this dividing line here is basically like if you were to predict, so this is a Breyer score of 0.25, so that's a 50-50 prediction. So if you predicted 50-50 on everything, you'd more or less pile up here at this Breyer score of 0.25. So you can see that, you know, in this very crude sense, the system is doing very well. Almost all questions, I think it's like 90+% of them that I have to, maybe 90% or so, are on the right side of 50%. And then there are very few that are just catastrophically wrong over in the like 0.7+ area. There are also, so those are binary questions. For continuous questions, for predicting continuous values, there's no Breyer score for that, but you can, another popular score is the log score. So the log score is essentially the log of the probability that you attribute to something. And for these continuous questions in particular, what you predict is a probability distribution. So here's the probability distribution predicted by somebody about something. I don't know what it was, but whatever it was, there were 9,000 of them or so that happened. And so this predicted probability distribution, you read off the value of it where the actual value occurred, and take the base 2 log of that, and that gives you the log score. So this is there are information theoretic reasons to like the log. You know, it's the basis of information theory in a lot of ways, the log of the probability of something. So at any rate, here again is a plot. Now confident in wrong is to the left. Confident in right is to the right. If you were to just make uniform probability distributions, that would be this vertical line here. And so you can see that almost all the predictions are doing better than just like total ignorance, predicting a uniform probability distribution. And then it's hard to get exactly a feel for this, but these are right around here at 3.75 is like the narrowest probability distribution that Metaculus will currently let you make. And this has motivated me to think about making that ability to make it narrower, because they're kind of piling up at the narrowest possible probability distribution. So that says that we're limiting people by that. But that also means that people are doing quite well. They're making a lot of very narrow predictions that are turning out right. So in short, the system is working well. It's making predictions where you can quantify how well it's done. It's accruing a track record. When there are other systems that do similar things, we try to compare to them where we can, so we can see where we're doing better and where we're not doing as well. So that's kind of Metaculus as a whole. Does anybody have, I'm about to turn to like sub-metaculi, or we don't have a word for that, subdomains of Metaculus. Are there questions though about the system as a whole before I get into more specific ones?
Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask away.
Have you been able to investigate any correlation between the crowdsourced predictions and what actually happens? I know it very much depends on what type of question we have, but is there a category of questions where the correlation could be noticeable?
I don't think I quite understand what you're asking.
Well, since we have 275,000 visitors and 250,000 of predictions, so it tells me that the volume of it could be a representative weight in public opinion in general, and that might impact what actually happens. Maybe not on the global scale, but
I see. In a causal sense, yeah. I think most. I haven't. So the question, as I understand it, is: have I thought about the fact that making predictions on Metaculus might actually, turn around and affect things that are happening? My guess is not yet, in the sense that although there are a lot of people coming, it's still just really thousands of people who are making predictions a lot. And most of the questions are about pretty big and general interest things. I think there are very few examples of questions where you are about things where a single person has much of a handle over making those things happen. There are some exceptions to that. And there aren't sort of monetary rewards for changing an event outcome to match your prediction, like there might be in a prediction market, for example. So if you had a prediction market and you staked millions of dollars on it, if it was a market that allowed you to do that, then you might be highly motivated to try to affect the outcome of that thing and win that amount of money in the prediction market. Here, there isn't that level of financial incentive. The incentives are very small where they exist. And so I don't think there's, nobody's going to go through the effort of changing some major world event to make it match Metaculus. But, my hope is that as time goes on and it becomes more influential and widely looked at, that it's certainly that it might have an effect. That's certainly the point, is to influence what people do and decide. And it certainly will be interesting to see and I don't know if this can be done, statistically, or if it'll always just be anecdotal, but see sort of what the effect Metaculus has in in people making decisions. So I'd love to see that, but I don't know if that's something you could pull out of the data at the moment.
Anthony, how much better is the best predictors, so the aggregate prediction, than the sort of best predictors? Just if you just took the best individual contributors, and then how much better is the aggregate than that?
Not much, because it's basically a mashup of the best predictors, and they tend to be pretty well calibrated. So the things it does is recalibrate and weight at the moment. So I think we're working on better versions of the Metaculus prediction. I can say a little bit more about that, but at the moment, the best predictors are more or less similar to the Metaculus prediction. The crucial difference there are two differences. One is that it knows who the best predictors are, so you can find out their Metaculus score and know who the best predictors are. But without that, you wouldn't necessarily know. So that's part of the point. The other is that it has a prediction about every question, and we're now getting to the point where no single predictor can make predictions about every question. So it's sort of an automatic way of getting the best few predictors on every question to make a prediction on it. And so if we computed the Metaculus points, like put it on the leaderboard, and I think we should probably do this, it would be like, way, way, way higher than everybody else, because it makes a prediction on everything and does the best, the best-ish possible job on everything. And hi, Adam.
Hi. Do you have a score for how well calibrated they are? I mean, all the ones that you mentioned, those other scores, and the Metaculus score, it sounds like you get rewarded just for volume as well as for being well calibrated, just for making lots of predictions. Do you have an actual just sort of calibration score?
Well, yeah. So you can get the mean Breyer or the mean log score, or you can get the mean Metaculus score also. So the Metaculus score just divided by the number of questions. So all of those reward just accuracy. There's also a calibration plot, but it doesn't have a numerical score attached to it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's actually quite tricky to figure out what is the right. You don't want to reward people just for like picking and choosing the questions that they particularly want to answer. That's useful.
Okay. It sounds like you can run up the Breyer score just by choosing really obvious things with very certain outcomes.
That's right. So if all you want is a good mean Breyer score, then you want to just pick all the things that are like 0.1 or 0.9%, 10 or 90% probable or better, and just only make predictions about those and never predict 50% on anything. So you don't want to incentivize that. The log score is a little better on that front because it punishes you badly when you are confident and wrong. So you really have to be kind of well calibrated at the ends also. But we devised the Metaculus score in some sense to try to like split the difference between these various things, so that it encourages participation, but also punishes being terribly wrong, and also rewards being better than everybody else. So and so on. But there's no single way to sort of compare a corpus of predictions to another different corpus of predictions. The best I think you can do is pick the same set of questions, compare two different people making predictions about those using a few different metrics. And this will reveal certainly if someone's significantly better than the other person. It won't reveal if they're like a little bit better here and there and not other places, I think. Okay, other questions?
Yeah, question. So how do you guys decide the time of closing? And when you talk about the track record, is it like integrated over time, or is it a snapshot at a particular time of a prediction? Because obviously like the probability will change a lot over time.
Yeah, this is something I think that needs to be improved, is that right now the track record that you see is just based on the sort of prediction at question close. And if those, and for some questions, if the close time is really close to the resolving time, it's pretty obvious what's going to happen. So the Metaculus score, the one you get points for, is averaged over time. And I think we probably are going to change the track record so that the Breyer score and the log score also averaged over time, so that because that's, I think, just the right way to do it, to reward being right early. So at the moment, when you go to the track record, what you're seeing is at the close time. Now, the question of how to set the close time is also a tricky one, because there are lots of conflicting demands. You want to set it late so that you let people make predictions, you know, up until the end, because it's still useful information that you want. You want to set it early though, so that, you know, there's some mystery as to what happens, and it gets awkward. You know, it feels much less like a prediction when, you know, the thing is going to happen tomorrow and it's totally obvious what's going to happen tomorrow. So, but I think time averaging is the right way to split that difference. So we have to do a better job of kind of like making that front and center, that it's time averaged in that way.
Thanks.
Okay, so let me then go on and talk a little bit about, I want to get it. So one of the things we instituted some months ago is that there's Metaculus Prime, which is kind of the thing that you get at metaculus.com, but then we can create now sort of separate instances of it where it acts more or less as a filter, where if you go to, say, the Metaculus AI project, there are some questions that appear both there and on Metaculus Prime, some that appear just on Metaculus Prime, that's most questions, and some that appear just on the AI project. And they can also be private communities. So Metaculus AI was private, it might go public soon. But the point of these was to kind of create more custom communities where you could really delve in and focus on some particular set of questions without overwhelming the main Metaculus site. And also, if we want to have, you know, a private community that wants to do things on their own, that we can set that up. So there's of order 4 of these operating now. 2 of them somewhat hibernating, the finance experiment that was really about figuring out how to make bots and things, that's kind of in the background. The AI project that I think could use rekindling, and then the pandemic project, which I want to talk a lot about today, which was launched a few weeks ago now, I guess. So in terms of the pandemic, I think what's been made very clear is that exponential growth plus life and death decisions are making a lot of people realize that they really need good predictions. Exponential growth is, or any kind of rapid growth is of a problem, means that as soon as the problem gets big enough for you to really like notice it, it's way too late to do anything about it, right? So you really have to do something about an exponentially growing problem way ahead of time by understanding that it's exponentially growing and that it is going to become a major problem in the future, and then what you want to do about it. So I think that has changed a lot of people's understanding at some level of the importance of predictions. Good predictions are always important, I think, in making good decisions, but I think this has just brought that to a much more clear point, both by raising the stakes in terms of like individual and collective, you know, health of ourselves, of our economy, of social systems, and so on. Plus the fact that we just, every action that we take now at some level has to depend on predictions of what's going to happen in a very tangible way. And doing things after the fact, it tends to be exactly the wrong thing to do, unfortunately, as we've seen. So we launched this. It is dedicated to COVID-19, the pandemic, and closely related issues. So there are like major subsections on global epidemiology, like case numbers, fatality numbers, and so on. Government policy in terms of lockdowns and responses and so on. Medical interventions, vaccine development and distribution, hopefully someday, antivirals, and so on. Social and political impact, like how this is affecting both political campaigns eventually, political systems, social impacts it's having, testing and tracking, and then clinical science, sort of scientific questions about reinfection, or, you know, fatality rates are kind of in epidemiology and kind of in clinical science, how the virus might evolve, things like that in clinical science. The idea here is that almost all pandemic-related questions will appear here, but only some subset of them will also be cross-posted to the main Metaculus site. Those of kind of the highest profile or widest interest, keeping like 10 vaccine questions on pandemic, but the sort of high level, like, will there be a vaccine this year or something like that, might be on Metaculus Prime. We've got about 3 full-time personnel working on this, which is a little bit which is actually much more than we've had working on Metaculus in the past, but is still probably not really commensurate with the size of the community or what's going on. There's a lot of volunteer work that does go on effectively in Metaculus though, so this is sort of more than it seems. We've got a new sort of dashboard. One of the things that we've realized about Metaculus is it's very built and customized for people making predictions. It's less optimal for people who, especially amongst a like wider group who are a little bit less love to just like read long blocks of text and look at formulas and look at probability distributions. Those who are consuming predictions, it's a little bit less friendly to them. So we're working on a sort of dashboard that will allow prediction consumers to more easily engage with all the content that's there. So there's a version 1, which does nothing like what I said. It's like a bunch of graphs that you can mess with. So people on this call will love it. But we're working on a version 2 that is a little bit more like friendly to the wider populace of decision makers and so on. We've got support for this project from various sources: Jan, Talon, OPP, the EA Long-Term Fund, and Metaculus itself in the form of generously donating tons of my time and those of other people's. And there are collaborations going on with several other organizations, and we're looking for more with OTT, with epidemicforecasting.org, the Johns Hopkins Prediction Project, and a few others. The point of this, the goals, are really to provide central aggregation and discussion point for predictions. There are a lot of models going on out there, and I think probably a lot of those are quite good, but it's hard to know which of them to look at, and most of them are making sort of case and fatality and so on projections. It's not clear exactly how to compare them. It's not clear which ones to trust more. And lots of them don't cover a lot of the things that you might want to know about, like vaccine times, or just what is the current best sort of community estimate of some modeling parameter, like the case fatality rate or the infection fatality ratio. So even for things that aren't predictions, like some of those numbers, Metaculus is a nice aggregation point, but it's also a nice aggregation point for kind of bringing together many different modeling efforts, even if those individually are excellent. So Metaculus, I think, does not want to compete with excellent modeling efforts outside. Rather, it wants to like bring them in and compare those excellent modeling efforts with other modeling efforts and give people a sort of consensus picture of what's going on. The hope is to provide useful and actionable forecasts to decision makers, as in general, but this is particularly important now. And I think in a longer and wider sense, I think we want to sort of exhibit the utility of reputation-based prediction systems and well-calibrated predictions in general past the pandemic. These are things that we should be looking at in general. We should always be looking at it. We should always be looking for a system of like assessing probabilities for events, especially like improbable but high impact events, that we can trust and take action on the basis of. A quick status report is that it's grown pretty quickly. We've got 175 questions live after a few weeks with 32,000 predictions on them. The track record has been like weirdly good. I don't expect this really to hold up, but the average Breyer score on the binary questions is like 0.03, and the log score is quite high. This is a little bit misleading on some of these questions because a lot of them were open fairly close to the resolution date. So they're among this class of questions where it's pretty clear what's happening by the time this score is recorded. But I was also saying in a lot of the cases, the prediction has been relatively constant in time. So there really was some predictive accuracy early on. So we'll have to see how this plays out, but so far the predictions have been quite good, I would say. Some fun ones that are worth looking at, and I'm happy to take votes on what people would like to look at in more detail, but as a somewhat interesting example, back in January 1st, this question closed: a major naturally originated pandemic, let's see if I can Is everybody seeing that? I'm not sure if it actually is
Yes.
showing you. Is it showing you the Metaculus
I can-
page or the presentation now?
I can see,
Presentation.
no, it's still the Metaculus page.
No, it's still the presentation. It's a slide
Okay.
presentation.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Like,
Let's see. I have to. Oh, there we go.
It's Keynote. I'm happy to
There we go.
notice.
Are you now seeing the Metaculus
Yeah.
page?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So this amusingly closed in January, asking the probability basically of something like this happening, a major naturally originating pandemic by 2026, with a surprisingly high value of 36% on the Metaculus score. It was somewhat lower in the community score. Then then in January, late January, we opened one of the sort of headline questions on the coronavirus pandemic. Interestingly, you see sort of back in early February, the Metaculus prediction jumped up to like a prediction of about 1.52 million deaths as a result of it. So that was like an early prediction in early February. Then it kind of, it's hard to know because these are just the percentiles, not the whole distribution. But it declined a little bit more, like more in line with what other people were saying, I think. And then as it sort of steadily became evidence how bad things were, it kind of came up again in mid-March to around its current value again of 2 million fatalities in 2020. So that was kind of interesting to me to see. If you can look at the community prediction, there's no hint of that early prediction of like a majorly disastrous event. That was kind of just a small number of high reputation predictors that were actually making that. And then there's a few more. I'd encourage you to just go. I don't want to take too much time looking at them, but I'm happy to address any individual ones.
I have a question about the whole thing,
Okay.
which I'm sure you've thought of a lot, which is, how can I say this? It's kind of the filter bubble idea. What I mean by that is there's people, as you point out, there's a community, I don't know what you said, 1,000 or something like that. There's people who are on Metaculus and they're making predictions, and they're making predictions about all kinds of things, presumably that they know not that much about most of these things because they're smart, but they haven't been studying them for very long. Okay.
Right.
Like most of us with COVID-19, for instance. Okay. So I guess what I'm going to ask is that, do you have any speculations on how that affects the outcomes? Like how the fact that you have this community of people with their it's a biased sample, and does that matter? And if so, how?
Well, it depends what you mean by bias. It's certainly non-representative of people in general, but I think that's probably a good thing. I mean, we want people who are good at predicting foremost, and then secondarily, may have some smattering of subject expertise that overlaps with the particular set of questions they're addressing. So I think the hope is very much to select, at least in predictors, for prediction skill, and that's the primary thing. And I don't think we want it to be representative in that way. There's I think an open question as to how and in what way to bring in actual subject matter expertise. Like, should it just be that subject matter experts come and make predictions and do really well in their subject, and that gets folded into the whole system in terms of their track record? Maybe that's the right thing to do. Is there some way to like label, oh, look, they have a PhD in this, so we should give their prediction a little bit more weight? We could think about something like that. It's tricky because often subject matter expertise is kind of very helpful, but not at all sufficient for being a good predictor about something. If you, for example, physics is my day job. If you go and make a prediction about, like if I were to make predictions about citation rates of some papers, for example, it would be helpful for sure that I understand what those papers are saying and what they're about and so on. But I bet I could be easily outperformed by someone who just has a really good fitting formula for the shape of citation rates and takes a few points and fits them to that curve and extrapolates what the citations are going to be, right? So in that example, all my domain expertise is like helpful, but not as helpful as being a good like predictor with a good method. And that can be, and a lot of questions can fall somewhere in between. I think there is a prediction skill that people get better at, and the system helps them get better at, that is somewhat distinct from subject matter expertise. So, which I very much don't want to diminish, and in many cases it's really crucial. But exactly how to fold those in, other than through just performance, I think we haven't really decided on or figured out yet. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but if not, just try again and I'll try again.
No, thanks. That's good enough for now.
Okay.
I also have a question. Is there any other question like the one, the early 2026 pandemic question, where there's like a weirdly kind of like high percentage of people actually predicting something quite consequential occurring before a near future date, where we should be looking more. So or another way of phrasing the question is like, when have you found out that actually so many people were predicting on this question that it's actually a high likelihood? Like, did you go back after the pandemic happened, you were like, oh man, people predicted this? Or how can we catch that earlier and maybe build that into more of a kind of like preparation angle?
Yeah, I think that will start to come out more naturally now that we have. So at the time that the pandemic started, or back in January, we didn't have the Metaculus prediction for these numerical questions. So I didn't see that spike until recently, rather than back then. The only thing that I saw was that the #1 predictor in Metaculus dialed down their probability that that the world population would increase every year for the next 10 years. And that was sort of an alarm, from like 99% to like 96 or 95 or something percent. And said, because it's because of what's happening in China, and this was back in like late January or early February or something. So that kind of set off alarm bells in me, which if anyone had said that, I would have said, okay, let me look at the numbers. But because it was the #1 predictor on Metaculus, who I just know they're better at predicting than I am, like I make a bunch of predictions, he's better at it, that causes me to pay a lot more attention to that. So I think that should start coming naturally out of the system, but we should, it might be interesting to create some discussion or some way of like, where are some canaries in the coal mine where there's kind of where we could look for a big difference between like the Metaculus prediction and the community prediction, and say like, oh, look, the people who are the most skilled at this are telling us something different than the common knowledge. And we should be looking at paying attention.
I mean, it would also help, because I think there was a lot of discussion about, that like old Yudkowsky post on there is no fire alarm for AI safety. And then people were discussing like, how can we do a fire alarm for pandemics or for anything, for any kind of like risk that is popping, where it's unclear when you should start getting worried. And so I think making that maybe in advance of like, hey, we should start getting worried if, so and so many people on Metaculus think that this will be so and so likely. So I think, making that kind of like early, almost as an artificial, kind of like threshold after which to get worried, or a switch to a different mode would be an interesting idea as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that will at some level rely on people actually believing it, as all these, right? Because there are always going to be people that say, worry about this thing, you're not worried about this, but you should be, and they get ignored. And often they should have been ignored. That thing doesn't happen. But then, if the right response to that should be to try to look for what is the actual probability that thing, might happen. And even if it's small, if the impact is big, you might want to do some real preparation for that. So like most of the time, ignoring people who say, oh, there's going to be a pandemic this year is like right in the sense that there's no pandemic, but it's wrong in the sense that if what they're really saying is there's a 10% chance of a pandemic, then you should be looking at 10% of the trillions of dollars that it's costing us, and at least spending a small fraction of that preparing for the pandemic. So I think both looking for those canaries and also like being able to trust the probabilities that they're assigning to things lets you take rational action about them, rather than like, should I take this seriously, yes or no, as like a binary thing. We should not be thinking about it that way. So some plans. Some of the things we're hoping to do are launch this better dashboard that is sort of more widely and easily accessible for people consuming predictions. Better effort to integrate with external modeling, so easier ways to get things out of Metaculus, do some modeling over here, and then bring them back in as predictions. Continued and expanded collaboration. We've got several going on, but we're always looking for more partners who are interested in either helping make predictions or use them or comparing them with other systems and so on. Make more detailed cross comparisons with other efforts, between the other efforts and between them and Metaculus. And then really crucially, try to get the word out and make something that is as useful as possible to the general public and to decision makers to help them make good decisions. And then I'll just close the presentation. I guess there's not going to be a ton of time for discussion, for further discussion, but maybe a little bit. So I'd certainly invite you to come and visit, make predictions. If you're sitting around making predictions anyway, as many people like us are obsessively doing, bring them to the site. And if you're connected with some like real modeling effort, also consider bringing that to the site, or starting up a collaboration. I think spread the word is very helpful. I think not nearly as many people know about Metaculus as could get a lot of benefit from it or would like to know about it. And of course, funding is always welcome. This project is reasonably supported in the short term, but of course it could do lots more if we had more funding and in the longer term. So I'll close the formal presentation there. I don't know if I've got a call at 10. I don't know if you generally go overtime with these. I could push off my call a little bit if there were interest in more discussion.
I also have a call, unfortunately.
Okay.
But let's see. Let's maybe take a question. I think Kriyan, you have your hand up. I don't know whether that's because you want to ask a question or whether it was still because you were voting. But if anyone else has one, feel free to say something.
Oh, that's stale. Okay.
Yeah, Christine had one who's here in the chat, and she's asking, she would love to hear examples of surprises or successes so far. Oh yeah, Christine, you want to further elaborate on the question?
Oh, you're muted. Oh, let's see.
Big examples. It's wonderful.
Sorry, I didn't hear most of the question because you were muted for.
I love it when you give specific examples of either surprises or successes. Would love to hear a few more of those in the few minutes you have left.
Yeah, I actually am resistant to this at some level, in that I think really what I find the most important thing about Metaculus is that the probabilities mean something, in the sense that if you go to someone on the street and say, what's the probability of this thing happening tomorrow? And they say 80%, like, what exactly do you do with that? Like, what does that 80% even mean? That thing has never happened before. It's never gonna happen again, probably. So you can't like think of it as a relative frequency. It's like some belief that this individual person has. Okay, great, you think 80%. On the other hand, when you go and look at the weather, if you look at from the National Weather Service, 80% means they ran a ton of models and 80% of them said rain tomorrow. And if you look at all the 80% rain forecasts, they've recalibrated so that actually on 80% of those days, it's rained. And I think, so that 80% you can actually really use, you could like multiply it by numbers to get expected value of carrying an umbrella and things like that. And I think one of the most important things that Metaculus does is actually contextualize probabilities. So if I see something that says 90% on Metaculus, I can attribute a meaning to that, which is that of all questions on Metaculus that say 90%, about 90% of those things happen. So there's like an ensemble that is defined by the set of Metaculus questions that I can now think about frequentist statistics over. And I can also, of course, think in other ways. But so I'm very reluctant to look at things where sort of Metaculus got something anomalously right as being contrary to that spirit. Like I think Metaculus should be like embarrassingly wrong about like 5% of the time or 1% of the time, and it should be like more or less on the money most of the time. If there's something that where, I mean, I think the interesting thing to look for, and I don't think we have that many great examples, are ones where most people defined in some way were predicting something. Metaculus is able to ferret out the prediction that was fairly different from that, and then that thing happened. So I think this is one example that is along those lines. But I don't think I could point to that many. I think what's I find with Metaculus when I look at questions that I look at the predictions, the probabilities that they're giving it, and I'm like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. Maybe I would have given that 60% and Metaculus is giving it 75 or 80. Okay, but I can believe 75 or 80. And I think that's kind of the way it should be. But the crucial thing is that 70, like over the long term, that 75 or 80 is just better than my 60. So that's a long, complicated avoiding of the question because I sort of resist anecdotal evidence for things. But I think it's an interesting question to try to identify a method for eliciting where is there hidden information in the community and like make as much use of that as we can.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's totally fine to help use Metaculus as a tool to help decision makers get a better feel for how to think about probabilities. They need to get better at that. And if Metaculus as a tool can help them do that, that's a huge benefit right there. Yeah,
agreed. But you might be right that you didn't say this, but I might take from your interest in this question that it's nonetheless useful to compile a list of like surprising successes just for PR purposes.
That's really what I was thinking. Gee, I should do a Facebook post, and I thought it would be really fun to get attention with something like that. Even though I do understand your basic point, which is in some sense it kind of undermines part of the theory of the site. But yeah, I was really thinking about marketing.
Yeah, so I might just set aside my statistical predilections and compile a list of those things.
Oh, it would be fun. We'd all love to read it in any case. So I love Metaculus. This is super important work, and we should all do what we can to make this work. Yeah, I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if anyone has kind of like plugs to, I think getting policymakers more comfortable with the idea would be a really good one. So I think that's definitely one, because really only if it really affects rational policy, that's kind of like the end game of the whole thing. We tried to have a foresight kind of like a foresight focused. So basically, last year at Vision Weekend, Anthony declared himself willing to let us use Metaculus to make predictions on the questions that the speakers had to the audience, and we're going to follow up on them on November 2nd this year. I just posted a link to that in the show notes here. So if anyone is interested in joining that prediction effort, we're gonna like have an award and a little crowning ceremony, maybe a virtual one. Let's see. I think, Anthony, I want to be very mindful of your time as well. I think we're now 3 minutes past 10. Thank you so much for joining. I'm hoping that you'll share a few links with me of how people can start predicting on the project and on how people can help. I thank everyone for joining and for your really great questions. And yeah, let's get more people predicting on it. And yeah, it would tremendously help if you share the page. I am seeing many of you again here tomorrow morning. And yeah, until then, I hope you have a lovely day. Anthony, thanks a lot for being flexible and for coming on. And yes, Anthony just shared the link, which is specifically about the pandemic Metaculus. So I think that's the one if you want to start following up on those specific questions right after the chat and get predicting and share the page with others. Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone. Be well.
All right, everyone.